Hi parents, I'm going to go over with you the money and clock models for adding and subtracting fractions. This is something that we use as a base for students because they are trying to still develop their fraction sense, and fractions just do not make sense to children, as I'm sure you remember when you were younger, or I know fractions didn't make sense to me when I was younger. So we try to use something that they are more familiar with, such as money and the clock. So here they have a 100 grid, so it's a 10 by 10 grid, so it has 100 pieces, and we just look at the different values. We first start out with the whole, and we talk about different ways that we can represent the whole. So we talk about the whole value, which is referring to a whole dollar, and we talk about how it's 100 pennies over 100 pennies. We talk about how it's 1 over 1, and then we kind of leave it at that. Next, we go to the 50-cent piece. And they actually take the 50-cent piece and they take different ones and they put them over the whole dollar. So then they can see that one 50-cent piece is one of the two pieces that it takes to get a dollar. So then they would write it as one out of the two pieces. It's important to, when you're talking about fractions, especially when they're still learning and trying to understand fractions, that you say that it's one out of the two pieces. So 1/2 is one of the two pieces. And then they write it as a decimal as well. So then they can see that it's 1/2 and it's 50 cents. And we also talk then about how it's 5/10, which we'll get into when we get to the dime, and I'll explain that a little bit more. The next one they'll explore is the 25 cents for the quarter. And so then they take the quarters and they see how many quarters it takes to make a dollar. So then they just cover up their dollar and they see that, oh, well, there's 4 quarters in a dollar, so 1/4 is one of the 4. So then they write that it's one of the 4. They also write that they can see that it's 25 little squares, so it's 25 out of the 100 squares. And this 50 cents is also 50 out of the 100 squares. So then they can just get a little bit more comfortable with that. After they work with the quarters, then we go to the dimes. So we go to the 10-cent pieces, and they take the dimes and they see that each dime is one of these columns. So a lot of kids will then just count the columns. So if I tiled this the whole way, it would take 10. And so there's 10 columns, so then they see that it is one of the 10 pieces for the dollar. And they see that it's 10 hundredths as well. Then we relate the 1/10 to the decimal value of 1/10 and the 10 hundredths to the decimal value of 10 hundredths. And we talk about how these two values are actually the same thing and how you can put zeros at the end of decimals and it doesn't change the value. Still saying I have 1 in the tens place, 1 in the tens place, and I don't have anything here in the hundredths place. And there's no value here in the hundredths place. So then that brings us over here, how we talked about the 5/10 is really 50 hundredths. And then they went and they stacked the 5 dimes to prove that 5/10 is equal to 50 hundredths. And they added the 5/10 right there. Then we went to the nickels. So they went to the nickels and they went ahead and tiled the dollar with the nickels, and they saw how it was one of 20 pieces. So it was one of 20 pieces it took to equal a dollar. We also talked about how 20 times 5 equaled a dollar, and that they'd want to call this 1/5, even though it really isn't 1/5. They're still having quite a lot of difficulty with realizing that nickel is not 1/5. And then after we saw that it's 1/20th, we also said that it's 5 hundredths. And then we wrote it as 5 hundredths. We also then discussed the difference between 5 hundredths here and the 50 hundredths right there, and how the place value is really important. After we did the nickel, we moved on to the penny. And we talked about how the penny is one of 100 pieces. So it's 1 out of 100 pieces, and we would then write it as 100th. After we had the penny, we went back and we looked at how we could make quarters with nickels and how we could make other values with the nickels. So we saw that a quarter is actually equal to 5 nickels, And since 1 nickel is 1/20th, then a quarter would be 5/20. So we added in our quarter the 5/20. And we looked at how many nickels it took to make a dime. So it took 2 nickels to make a dime. So then a dime was 2/20. And we talked about how many nickels it takes to make a 50-cent piece. And we saw that it was 10 nickels. So then that would be 10/20. And for the whole dollar, it'd be 20/20. Once they realize this, and they're like, oh, this is also 4/4 and 10/10, and it's 2/2, since it's all the other denominators for that. We then notice that the quarter is half of the 50-cent piece. So then when we went to the 50-cent piece, we said that that was also equal to 2/4. The important reason for this is that the students can then use this type of information to help them add and subtract fractions. So if they have a problem, such as 3/4 plus 2/10, they can find a way to add it. So they can take their 3/4 or their 3/4, and then they can take the 2/10 value. And then a lot of times they'll swap these 2/10 for the nickels, and they'll fill them up. And then they will see that it is equal to 95 hundredths. Others, this is for the students who are lower level with understanding fractions, this is how they would do it. The students who are at a higher level of fractions, they would automatically change these into a common denominator and realize that they're both 20ths, or realize that they're both hundredths. So if they did 3/4, then they would write this as 75 hundredths. Or they might even write it as a decimal of 75 cents. And then they would see the 2/10, they would know that that would be 20 hundredths to get our 95 hundredths. And they would know that that would be 20 cents to get our 95 cents. This is a way to get them more fluent with mental math as well. So you might be thinking, why are you making my child do this? It's to help them be more flexible with the numbers and being able to use them in different ways. If they did the 20ths, then they could have done the 3/4 and seen that there's 5 20ths in each one. So it'd be 15 20ths. And the 2/10, they can see that that would be 1/20th. And, sorry, 2/10 would be 4/20ths with the 4 nickels. And then they would get a total of 19 20ths. So that's just a little bit of what we've been doing with the money models. The clock models have been very similar. We've been looking at those. So we looked at the whole clock value, and we talked about how that could be 60 minutes over 60 minutes. We also talked about how it could be 12 hours out of 12 hours. Then we looked at the 1/2 value. We knew that it was 6 out of 12, or it was 30 out of 60. Then we looked at the fourths. We saw that it was 1, 2, 3 out of 12 hours, and also 5, 10, 15 minutes out of 30 minutes. Sorry, out of 60 minutes. Then we looked at the thirds. They're actually doing pretty well with the thirds, with making sure that they all have 4 sections in them. And they saw that it was 1, 2, 3, 4 out of the 12 hours, or 5, 10, 15, 20 out of the 60 minutes. And then we looked at sixes. They talked a lot about how sixes were just thirds cut in half, so that was really good thinking on their point. And here they saw that sixes was 2 out of the 12 hours, or 5, 10 minutes out of the 60 minutes. With this information, they were able to, and then 12s. So it's 1/12 or 5 out of 60. With this information, they were then able to add the different fractional values with these type of denominators. So if they had 2/3 plus 1/4, they could look at them. So they can see that the 2/3 would be this amount. So it'd be 4 12s and 4 12s to give us 8 12s. and they saw that the 1/4 is equal to 3/12. And then they added them together and got their 11/12. Or they could have physically put them together to get their 11/12. Again, this is just a way for them to have like something to help them and something to relate them to when they're adding fractions, and to get them to see that we had to have the same piece size. So we talked about the 12ths with this one. We could have went to the 60ths if we chose to, but we had to have them the same size. We couldn't just do 1/4 and 2/3 and just add straight across, which is what kids automatically want to do. So I hope this was helpful. If it was too long, I'm sorry that I took your time. If you have any questions, give me a call or send me an email or anything. Thank you. Bye.